All good?
Yep.
All right.
Remember, there's a 10-second delay.
Yes. Welcome. Welcome to the folks that have joined us in person. Welcome to anybody viewing this online, either as we are broadcasting live or later once it is posted on the channel for all to see. Welcome to our second Nick Talk of the fall 2024 semester. Probably the final Nick Talk of the semester. We're not going to do one once we get back from Thanksgiving. But it is International Education Week, and we wanted to bring that discussion into this space here. So I'm Nick Galante. I'm the Information Literacy and Technical Services Librarian, and one of the library Nicks. My co-host down at the other end.
Which I'll be on my phone only because I have to monitor online chat, but I'm Nicole Rivera. I'm the Public Services Librarian of the Tuscan Library, so I'm the second half of the library Nicks.
We've got two panelists with us today. I'll let you guys introduce yourselves.
Okay. So I'm Yvonne Miranda. I am the director of the graduate programs in the education department, as well as the supervisor of field experiences and student teaching.
And I'm Dr. Kelly Hall. I'm the director of global initiatives and international programs here at the college. I lead the sophomore expedition, and I oversee all of our study abroad programs.
So, in addition to the experience that you guys have, in your positions here at Cedar Crest, working with different demographics and different populations of students, when we were doing our pre-meeting, I learned that all of us have had some experience getting our own educations from other cultures. So my graduate work was in Ireland. Yvonne, you studied in Ecuador a little bit.
Yeah, I've studied a few years of my elementary and high school years in Ecuador.
I studied in France for a year when I was in college, and I got my master's degree. Weren't technically for educational purposes, but were very educational, like a Rotary Goodwill Exchange in Brazil or working in Antarctica.
I don't have overseas experience.
You do,
I
Dublin?
I do. I have Dublin, where I traveled as a tour coordinator, so I helped guide the students if they got lost and things like that. And I have experience just traveling as a kid to different countries.
So the focus, as our title of our Nick Talk today, is around the world and learning from each other. Since it is International Education Week, we wanted to talk about how, we as educators, people in academia, navigate talking to people, interacting with people, teaching people from different cultures and engaging with people from different cultures, and how we might adapt some of our teaching to that. One of the things that we talked about, that the four of us talked about, is a phrase that I think, Kelly, you were the one who mentioned it, English privilege.
Yeah.
We can start with that, and you want to explain what that is?
Sure.
First and foremost?
So most of us have probably heard of the idea of white privilege, that, if you are white or grew up in a predominantly white area, that you have some advantages that you may not even realize. There's also a sort of similar effect called English privilege, whereas if you grew up speaking English, or you learned it very young, or you grew up bilingual, that you have an advantage when you travel the world. Because a lot of other countries, you go to France and you hear a Chinese person speaking with a German person, they're most likely going to be speaking English, right? To the French people as well as to each other. So if you know English, traveling the world, it's easier for you, right? Because that's the sort of lingua franca of the world now, the language that everyone knows and speaks to some degree. And certainly in tourist areas, right, that's going to be the number one language people speak with you, secondary to the language of that country. So knowing English is an advantage, but also understand that when you're working with international students, that English is not their first language, right? And so, I can remember studying abroad in France, and I had 4 years of high school French. I had 2 years of college French. My French was decent, right? But, you get there, and it's just like everybody's speaking French so quickly. And I was always asking people, in French to just slow down, or could you please repeat that? And so when I started teaching ESL class years ago at the beginning of my career, mainly to Japanese and Korean students, I realized that it was really important just to slow down and enunciate as a teacher. And now I just sort of automatically flip to that when I'm talking to somebody who English isn't their first language, whether it's a student or not. I just slow down a little bit, I enunciate more, and I use a little bit easier phrases maybe, or like the words that everybody's going to know versus a slang word, or a more complicated or technical word, or something that maybe you haven't mastered if you're studying another language. And I just find that really helpful, and that's a piece of advice I like to offer people working with international student populations. And likewise, if you're a tourist, you're an English speaking tourist and you're somewhere else, the person's probably going to speak some English, right? And they're doing their best, but it's also helpful to you if you slow down and you enunciate more, and you get I'm sure we've all heard of like the angry, ugly American tourist, right? Who, steps up to the counter in France, and the person's like, bonjour, and he's like, I want 4 tickets. And the person's like, pardon, because they don't speak English. He's like, I want 4 tickets. Yelling doesn't make them understand your English better, right? We've all probably seen or heard of that example, right? So we have Google Translate now. That's really helpful. I find that to be great. Around the world, people are so appreciative when you can tap that in your phone and show them, and then they read it and they smile, and usually it's very, very helpful. That's my bit of English advice.
Yeah, and it's even, I would like to tie that into like different dialects, because depending on where you go, there's different versions of that language. So like me and you, Yvonne, have talked about this, but like different dialects in Spanish culture. So I'm open about the fact that I don't speak this Puerto Rican Spanish. I speak Cuban Spanish, Dominican Spanish, occasionally South American or Mexican dialects, but it's hard to distinguish the Texan of which dialect to use in that moment. And the same to be said in English language, because the deeper the accent, the harder it is to understand, or even if they use slang, how do you know what they're saying? So like a good example I like to give is like soda versus pop. How we say soda on the East Coast predominantly, but in the Midwest they call it pop.
Yep.
So those are things I like to think about when it comes to language, and even like English privilege, because I didn't even think about the fact that English is very prominent in most countries because it's something that's universal, but it's not the primary.
Yeah.
Dr. Hall, you mentioned something of like when an English speaker is presented with a non-English speaker to enunciate and speak slowly. I remember an experience when I was in Ecuador in 5th grade, and I have to say that at that moment I was bilingual, and there's a difference between a bilingual person and a biliterate person. Bilingual person is someone who can speak 2 languages, but not necessarily means that they're able to read and write in the other language. Yep. Versus biliterate means you're proficiently able to speak, write, and read in both languages. Well, at that time I was just bilingual, and I remember, and one of the things that how they teach over there in Ecuador is that they dictate. They don't write on the boards, they dictate. So everyone needed to pay attention, the kids needed to pay attention and write. And I remember that I was just learning how to write the language, because I could understand, but how to write it, I remember my brain just freezing. I'm like, oh my gosh, how do you spell the word, encontrando? I'm like, and my teachers knew that I wasn't, from Ecuador completely, but it was just like that lack of understanding of the students and knowing where they're coming from and the cultural differences that I was like, and I remember thinking like, oh, that's it, I gave up. And I didn't do anything else because, and I imagine that this same situation happens to our students at the K-12 level, but also our college students when they're coming from a different country and they're just, at a situation where, the professor, whoever's in front, is lecturing and they're just like at a point like, I don't get it. So they give up. I think that's something that as an educator we have to be very mindful of when we're working with our international students or even students who they might be U.S. citizens, but like me, for example, I'm going back and forth from my countries that sometimes you have to wonder, well, actually, where are you from, right? And we have a lot of our kids who are like that. Just being mindful, that's really important, and not many who are, but it's not done on purpose. It's just like not getting to know your students. So but once you do, that it makes a whole lot of difference. I mean, especially when you're new and you're trying to understand the language and writing and doing all of that. So that I just remembered that experience on like brain fog. I'm like,
Yeah, and especially the students that like English isn't their first language, but they were born in the country because their family's primary language is a different language.
Yeah.
right.
And then once they learn English, they became the translator for their family.
Mm-hmm.
And like being mindful of the fact that they have to like translate everything and be aware of everything and like possibly do paperwork and things like that. How do you meet them where it doesn't seem too hectic as an instructor, but still meet them in what you need to teach them type thing?
Well, yeah, and I think that's especially challenging, like, from my perspective at least, like teaching writing, teaching like college level composition to people for whom English is not their native language. Like they're not only having to navigate the translation of a new language, but they're also at the same time trying to compose a paper in that new language at a level that's going to be acceptable for college level writing.
Right.
Like,
And in their
Right.
own voice.
yeah, like that's a really difficult tightrope to walk. I mean, Kelly, when you were doing your abroad in France, did you have to write in French?
Oh, mais oui. Yes. It was,
How was
I
your
was at the
French before
Sorbonne,
going over
and it was
there?
all French classes with French professors for the whole year. Yeah, it was like the hardest way you can do it. But, you know, also the best way to learn a language is just to kind of jump in, right? So definitely. And I had, I struggled with that. And I knew a fair bit of French, but just to, right? To not make it sound like, a kindergartner, like he walks to the mall or something, the
Yeah.
sort of things you could say when you take a year or two of class. But to say it in that college way, with the nice phrasing and even just to learn, and I think we're maybe going to touch on this later, like the way that different countries do research papers and writing assignments and
Yeah.
things, like beyond the language, there was that curve too, because it's different in other countries. And maybe we're going to touch on
I
that
mean,
later,
that can
but
be a
I'll-
great, that's
a
on my
great
list of
segue.
topics.
Oh,
It's a great
sorry.
segue, actually. So yeah,
Okay.
let's run with that. So,
Okay.
so let's start with, I mean, you're already talking about your time in France. So how is research different?
So research, especially, I think in America at the college level, in America it seems, because I went to college in America, right? It seems like writing papers was kind of proving that you had gathered information. I felt like a lot of my college papers were like that. Like I learned this about it, and I cited my sources and things, and here's kind of just the information that I gathered. Whereas I felt like in Europe, like it was really a step above that. Like what we might expect of graduate work here is that I was expected to kind of like make an argument or like kind of propose a new way of looking at something, like the sort of stuff that we don't usually do in America until graduate school, I think, at least in the humanities, right? And so I remember thinking like, wow, this is really hard to not just sort of gather information and make like a statement about it the way I might in America, but rather to be arguing that this is the way we should examine a certain character in literature, or that other people hadn't talked about this, right? I was expected to have a wider body of knowledge about whatever I was writing about than maybe the average American would in a similar class.
And how long were you in France?
For a year, so I studied my whole junior year there.
Well, and that was kind of my experience in Ireland. I mean, I wasn't navigating another language, although some parts
Kind
of
of.
Ireland, yes, it does feel like another language. Yeah, I mean, I remember I was working on my dissertation. I was getting to the end of my master's, and all the research that I was finding, I completely disagreed with on this book series that I was writing. There was not a lot of research, and the like 4 people that had written on it, I thought were completely off the mark. And I went to my advisor like in a panic, like, oh my God, what have I done? I'm making a case that like there's no research to support. And I was in grad school already because, like you said, there was that emphasis on, all right, do the research. Like, you can synthesize what you find, but to come right out and say everybody else is wrong about this?
Yeah.
Like, who am I? I can't do that. And my advisor was like, there you go. There's your introduction. Everybody else is wrong. It was just such a foreign concept to me.
Yep. That's a valid point. And I think, Yvonne, you were to talk about like plagiarism, right?
Yeah.
And sort of the differences there.
Yeah. So in Ecuador, so it's completely different. In Ecuador, the professors, the teachers, they teach the kids and even college students that when they're doing any research project, they have to literally copy what's in those books and present the information, because in their mind, in the way the culture is, like that information, you can't put your name on it. that information you can't switch, you can't turn it around. That information belongs to these researchers who have published, and therefore we have to take it as it is and present it as it is. So it's seen as a really negative thing if we try to switch things around and say, well, no, it's not seen appropriately over there. So when our kids in Latin America, in South America I should say, they come over to United States and they're trying to do the same thing, well, it's seen as plagiarism.
Yeah.
But the thing is that they've been taught how to do this all their lives in school, because we're not allowed to disrespect anyone else's work or try to get any type of credit. So again, we have to make sure that it's written the way we find it in the books. So
And I've encountered that with students in writing classes. That are,
It's hard for them to understand, like the citation. You need to paraphrase. You need to, if you don't agree with something, you find some research to argue, or around what you find. It's not. It's completely different.
It's kind of like, it's almost like from what Kelly, you and I have experienced in Europe, and Yvonne, what your experiences were in Ecuador. Like the U.S. is almost like the midpoint. You're supposed to find the information and sort of recite the information, present the information, maybe with some tweaks.
Yeah.
But don't go so far as to say everybody else is incorrect, here are my ideas. Whereas in Ecuador and other...
presented as it is.
Yeah, present it as it is, because you have not earned the right even to have your own spin on things.
Correct.
You need to just show us that you can find people who know what they're talking about.
Correct.
Which makes even more sense, because you told us about the fact that they have to, if they want to be on a certain path, they have to pass a test to become a doctor and things like that.
So the way Ecuador has designed their system for students to pursue any type of career, they have to take an aptitude test. And how they score, it gives them the choices of the career paths. So for example, if let's say that aptitude test, and I'm gonna just make up a number, it's 800, and you scored 600 points, and within those 600 points, you can be maybe a dentist, you can be maybe a secretary, you can do go into banking system, but you want to be a doctor, and in order for you to be an actual surgeon, you need to score those 800 points. Students are not allowed to go into enroll into any university without earning those points. If you want to, you need to study again, go back and take the test until you actually score those points, and then you're allowed to pursue that path, the career path that you want. Otherwise, it's not, you can't.
Much more restrictive SATs.
Yes.
So we did. I don't know. Did anybody else have to do the career aptitude tests in high school? 'Cause I did, and
Yes.
but I was allowed to ignore it then.
I think they talked to us about it, and then it never came to be. So, an example I like to give about the whole transition and all that is the fact that I'm originally from New York City. And transitioning to Allentown, which is still a city, but it's not as big as New York City, was a drastic change to me. Especially considering the exhortations of my high school teachers were completely different than my professors. And I've gotten into debates with my professors about writing styles, because I didn't know what MLA was. I wasn't taught that in high school, none of that. And when I tried to explain that, they were like, well, your high school teachers were horrible. They should have taught you this. So when I think of global learners, I also think about even national learners and the different parts in this country and how it's taught differently in the education system. And how even here it's its own mini ecosystem of different learnings.
Well, so being a culturally responsive teaching is new right now. It wasn't when we were in school. At least it wasn't when I was growing up. I might think I'm older than both of you, but it wasn't a thing. Now, we're very mindful that we re-educate pre-service teachers when there's professional development. I'm like, are you being culturally responsive? Are you meeting where your students are at? Are you getting to know them? Is there, is the curriculum that you're using, is it diverse and inclusive? So that's new for the last a few years, right? Maybe last 10 years, but it wasn't before. So, and again, there's still a lot of there's a lot of gains, but can we, is there more improvement for, is there room for improvement? Of course there is, right? I mean, there's a lot of growth in different areas where, where we can move on from being culturally responsive to developing a culturally sustained pedagogy where we're deliberately and to the point that it's just, we're so used to bringing in this diverseness into our teaching, being cognizant about the kids where they're at, teaching when we're teaching writing, when we're teaching reading, being, again, paying attention to the semantics and syntax of the language, right? Because that's important, because depending on the language that you are used to, it's completely different. I don't know about French, but in Spanish, our syntax is, with English, is the opposite. Like the nouns come before the verbs, right? In English, it's the other way around. I'm not sure how it is in French, but like again, these are things that we have to be mindful and understand it. And not saying that we have to teach in these languages, but just think about where our kids are coming from, right?
Yeah. So just to run with that a little more, like what kind of advice do you give your pre-service teachers to anticipate that, to sort of respond to that?
So right now, for example, here in Allentown, 80% of the students are enrolled in ASD are 80%, from the Hispanic population, and does that mean that 80% of the kids only speak English Spanish, right? And no English. It just means that they're coming from a Hispanic background. But one of the ways to help prepare pre-service teachers is to show them different types of pedagogical styles that they can work with. Like, for example, translanguaging, which means that when they're teaching writing or when they're reading, to look and seek out for these resources that will allow this to happen, which is using the students' home language. It integrates it with English so that they can start adapting and saying, oh, at least they recognize one word, some of the phrases out of there. So slowly they're starting to understand that language and helping them, if they're really proficient in their home language, those skills can be transferable over to the English language, which makes learning so much easier.
And on the opposite end of that, Kelly, since you do sophomore expedition, what do you tell students who are going to a different country, or what advice do you give them going into a different country to adapt them almost?
Well, they don't have to write in the language of the country they're going to, right? They don't have to do assignments in a foreign language. But as far as language goes, we certainly encourage them to learn some of the language, some of the basics. Of course, the next trip is Lisbon, so we've set up a Duolingo. We have a little contest going. There's going to be a prize as to who's accumulated the most Duolingo points, because we had heard from previous students, some who went to Dublin said they wish they had spoken a few words of Irish or knew that, which maybe wasn't quite as necessary in Dublin, but I think would be nice in Lisbon. I always tell people, just learn hello and please and excuse me and just a few phrases. You'd be amazed how far you can get with just a few. You can point and grunt and use two fingers for when you want two croissants. You can you can get through life that way, right?
Yeah.
And Google Translate helps if you've got something more complicated. And I've certainly used both of those methods before, with Google in recent years. But it's just really great to go to a country and just know a few words and just be able to say hello and thank you and excuse me. So it's really helpful. I often suggest learn the word beautiful. You could look at somebody's baby and be like, beautiful, right? Like Bella or, Lijepo in Slovenian, whatever it is that the word beautiful is. You could point to their city and be like, Pandeza in Tanzania, and people will be like, oh, they think it's beautiful, So it's that's a really nice word to learn as well.
So we have a question.
See, I just want to add, I tried to do that when I went, I had my honeymoon in Belgium, and I was like, I'm going to learn some French so I can get by. And the couple of times that I tried to start an interaction with somebody in a shop in French, I don't know if it was my pronunciation or what, they just immediately responded in English, and it was like, well, there goes that.
The French do get a rough reputation for their language, about being a little bit snippy about it, right? I studied there. People were usually pretty good to me and said my French is pretty good because I worked at it. But other countries maybe are a little bit easier about accepting of that. But I also find too, it used to be the opposite. The people French people would get really, upset when you didn't try to speak any French, whereas now, I think so many people speak French, especially in the places you're likely to see them, like in shops, restaurants, hotels, that they want to practice their English,
Yeah.
they want to get better, and they're pretty welcoming. So like the last time or two I've been there, you know, I was talking to a friend or on the phone or something, and then the person just started speaking English, and they were quite surprised when I came back in French. I'm like, no, I can go in French, like I'm all right with this. But I found that they have warmed to English over there.
So I'm sorry, Nicole, you said we have a question in the chat?
Yeah,
All right.
actually. Hi, Mara.
Mara! Hi, Mara.
She said, can you talk a bit more about the difference between culturally responsive teaching and culturally sustained teaching?
So culturally responsive entails when your curriculum is diverse. You're looking for stories and books from authors of color from different cultural backgrounds, and demonstrating it to your students, making sure that what you're using is a reflection of the students in your school, versus a culturally sustained pedagogy is that you're actually integrating that into your lessons, into the way that you're teaching. So for example, if I'm teaching my students how to write personal narrative story, and I want them to really feel that they're connected to the curriculum, as well as me being mindful of their culture. It's like, yes, you can write about your experience if you are from Nigeria, if you are from Poland, if you're from Santo Domingo or Puerto Rico. I mean, you can write them. There are certain words, like in the summer I went to visit my abuela. They know what that means, right? I'm okay with that. It means grandma, so they can write it down. There are certain words, and again in Spanish, there's some of those cognate words that are very similar, like elephant and elefante. Once we use that and integrate it into our writing, our students are able to see the difference. That's the difference between that being culturally responsive versus being having a culturally sustained pedagogy. It's being more cognizant again about integrating it into everything that you do. And is it an easy thing to do? It takes practice, right? It takes lots of practice, because the more you get to know your students, the more that you do research on the side, because you have to, do that if you want to get to know where your students are coming from and the language and all that. Then, it becomes easier. Mm-hmm.
I also find that students are more responsive if you're willing to meet them at that point.
Oh, absolutely.
In my writing class, I have students that will tell me, I only know this in Spanish. I don't know what the English translation is. I was like, well, write it in Spanish and then put the next sentence as a description of it. Mm-hmm. That way, if you don't know the translation, you can at least describe it so they can your reader can visualize it. Because at the end of the day, you're writing this for someone else to understand.
Mm-hmm.
So approach it from that sense.
Mm-hmm. And then I just wanted to add on to that cultural responsiveness is like I said, adding that trans-languaging when you're doing a read aloud, looking for books that offer both languages, that are integrated, that are merged together. When you're writing, again, merging the languages together. It doesn't mean that you're teaching in both languages, but then you're just helping the students be able to make that transition over to English only, versus just abruptly, here we go, and then they're, again, like me, you get a brain freeze or something.
Amira said thank you.
Sure.
So I want to circle back to Kelly. You were talking about some of the tips that you give to students, to Cedar Crest students who are traveling abroad, especially on the sophomore expedition. And you mentioned the linguistic differences, but what of the destinations that you've helped oversee and helped students get to, what do you think was the biggest culture shock for students that you had to prep them for in advance?
Maybe Morocco, which I think in many people's minds is maybe the most exotic destination that we've been to. So for example, we always have a dress code for expedition, which is just to meet some basic modesty standards, but it was stricter in Morocco, right? It's a predominantly Muslim country. Women are more covered up there. And we had a lot of questions from forward-thinking students ahead of time, like, do we need a hair covering? Do we need a scarf or whatever? The answer to that was no, because they did not have to have their heads or hair covered in any of the places we went. But I thought that was great that they asked. And obviously we did require, knees and shoulders to be covered all the time. We took the advice from our operators there that told us what to tell students. And everybody really did a great job with that. We didn't... really have to tell people like you're inappropriately dressed, you need to go change, you can't wear that. So that was maybe, I don't know, I'm looking over here to Dr. Burke, who went with us on that trip as one of the faculty members. So would you say maybe, because you've been on most of them, I would say, yeah, Morocco was maybe the greatest one.
Mm-hmm.
We give people a lot of tips along the way, like how, you know, a lot of people, non-Americans eat, right? With like both utensils at once, right? So I usually sit up there with like my knife and fork in front of all the students and be like, this is how Europeans eat, or this is how they fold lettuce, right? They don't cut it all up. Right, they fold it just like some. We try to give some little tips like that, and like if you want to try this before you go, right? What's that? Haggling. Oh yeah, that was great. Dr. Burke gets the points for that one. We taught the students how to haggle, how to barter for things in Morocco, right? Which we haven't really done on other expeditions. So we told them, you know, they give you a price, you counter, you try to meet in the middle. This is how it's done. Dr. Burke actually had one of her classes on this in her own class. And I was one of like the fake shopkeepers, right? And we had like the Monopoly money and the students had to practice bartering. And I pretended to be a shopkeeper that was like, oh, but I have to feed my family and I can't give it to you for that price. And the students were like, but I'm a poor student and I really want, you know, and we had that fun back and forth. And it gave them some confidence to do that. And then students came to me on the trip and said like, Dr. Hall, I got this for whatever. And I'm like, that's really good. You know, that's a good price. Or like they started this and I ended at that. I'm like, well, that was a great deal for both of you. So yeah. I would say Morocco.
Okay.
In which I want to add a plug because we just went to the discussion of this, but the next study tour that is open to also non-CETA people, right? Or is it just alums, faculty, and staff?
No, everyone.
Is France and England, sorry, in which they are doing beer, wine, and cheese focus. And if
And
you're
bread.
And bread, sorry. You gotta have bread to absorb the alcohol. And there's another one that's
okay.
Australia and New Zealand. I'm funding all of them. So if you're interested in all those, you can email Dr. Kelly Hall for more details, and she can tell you the pricing as well as send you the PowerPoints. And it's super fun, especially when you go with Dr. Kelly Hall and Dr. Burke, who's in our audience, because they tend to make it really fun and interactive, as well as make sure that you're covered and like safe, and like the hotels are nice and things like that. But you also still get immersed in non-touristy things, but like the actual
I
torture.
mean, we're doing good on time. Kelly, do you want to give like a 30-second pitch for Australia?
Sure I will. So yeah, we've got 3 different upcoming study tours actually that anybody can sign up for. Actually 4. There's 2 kind of sponsored by the School of Nursing. They offer, one is to Peru. It's in May of 2026. And then there's one to, it's in May of 2025, excuse me. And then there's one to Tanzania in January of 2026. You don't have to be a nursing major or health sciences major to go on those. And all these study tours are open to anybody. But that one is more about service learning. So you go into villages, you set up health clinics, and you help with healthcare on those, as well as doing some cultural activities. There is one led by Dr. Jean Burke and Dr. Andre Walther that's going to France and England, and that is based on the chemistry of beer, cheese, wine, and bread. So they are going to be tasting a lot of very yummy things. If you're interested in that one, reach out to Dr. Burke, Dr. Walther, or me for any of them. I'm just kelly.hall, Kelly.hall at cedarcrest.edu, and I can send you the information or have a session with you and tell you about them. The last one is one that's going in, and that the France and England one is in May of 2026. And the last one is one to Australia and New Zealand. It is also in May of 2026. That one's going to fly into Sydney, be in the city a little bit, look at some wildlife. It's a very interdisciplinary class, so we're looking at food, culture, tourism, sustainability, and the indigenous cultures, both the Aborigine and Maori, of those 2 countries. And then also then going over to New Zealand and spending about 6 days there. So if you're interested in any of those, reach out to me and I can send you some info. Thanks.
Yeah. It's International Education Week.
International
Had to
Education
give you a
Week.
platform to talk about.
There's a session tomorrow for the Australia New Zealand one. It's at 2 o'clock. It's in person.
And I also want to put Dr. Yvonne in the summer STEM program, if you want to pitch that a little bit.
Sure. So that's in the summer. It's for 3 to 5 year kids in 3 to 5 grades, and we do all different types of STEM activities, from electrical engineer, mechanic engineering, chemistry. Yeah, they make their own perfumes. Dr. Burke, and yeah, it's a fun camp. It only lasts 3 weeks though. So, but
And I love the name.
it's all our friends. all our friends.
I want to sign up for that one.
Yeah, I know. I'm jealous all the time. I'm like, I'm too old.
Yeah.
I was not a great chemistry student, so I should sign up for that one.
Oh yes, and it's one of the things that that I love doing, especially in during camp and with STEM, is that the environment becomes really relaxed and chill, and then the kids are just like very independent and very engaged, and I mean you can see they want to be there, they want to learn because they get to interact and touch all these different types of tools. And yes, you have to be very cautious because some of them are like, they use like the soldering iron, they use the 3D pens, they use different types of wires and like different types of gears, vibrating motors and things like that. So it's just like, it's fun. They find it really, really fun. Mm-hmm.
That sounds fun.
Yeah.
I know. We're too old for it, Heather.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Sorry, where were we?
Maybe I'll talk to the professor.
Right? Yeah.
Jumping around, trying to see what we haven't covered. Oh, we touched on this a little bit. Kelly, when you're talking about prepping students for interacting with in other countries and some of the etiquette and the cultural differences, is there? So we've talked about how teachers and instructors, academics can sort of adapt their teaching and prepare themselves for meeting their students of different cultural backgrounds, different experiences. But is there anything that we as instructors, as academics, as people who are interacting, are there any cultural differences that we should expect from the students, like maybe in the ways that they interact with us or the ways that they, address us or communicate with us?
You mean international students who are coming
Yeah.
here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, I'd already talked about language,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
But I think it's like especially if you're constantly working with maybe a population. So maybe it's students for the Dominican Republic or bilingual students, or maybe it's we have a large contingent here at Cedar Crest from Saudi Arabia, right? Is understanding a little bit about the culture that they come from. So, for example, I used to teach Japanese and Korean students, ESL. That was how I started my career. And in Asia, they were often hesitant to put forward a sort of solo idea, but they were happier with a sort of kind of group idea or plan that they could sort of present. And we actually read an essay in that class about how an American was working in a Japanese factory and put out like essentially a suggestion box, which people could put their anonymous suggestions in, but that nobody really did it. And when they kind of asked why or started to ask the other people at the company, they said, well, people aren't really likely to do an individual thing. So they kind of changed it to be like, okay, we'll put in like a group suggestion. And then the suggestions started to come in from like different departments or friends who ate lunch together or whatever about, well, hey, why don't you try this, or we can improve this by doing that. And so, I can remember calling out to students in class and sort of like, what is the answer or what is it? And the students feeling a little bit nervous about being singled out or called upon, which we do all the time in America, right? And then like once I read that and read that essay with the students, I thought, okay, well, I got better at being like, all right, well, what do you guys or girls or everybody think about this, right? Or, what would be maybe the Japanese response to this? And anybody could sort of answer. So I got better at not singling out in that American way, like, John, what's the answer to, to that? Because that made them less comfortable, but they felt more comfortable doing like a group project or working a little bit more with a group response.
I think another thing we have to consider, and we kind of touching on it, is like the holidays in those cultures too.
That's a good
Because like
point.
you mentioned in like a different discussion about how in France they didn't really celebrate like Thanksgiving or Christmas
Right.
or things like that. So the expectation with students from different cultures that celebrate different holidays than we do in America. So my student workers know that like if they celebrate Eid for my students that are of that culture, they're allowed to call out, or if they're fasting, to let me know, hey, like, are you okay with me calling out because like it's fasting, I don't have the energies and things like that. And I tell them yes, and I'm like, is there anything I can do to help you or things like that. And like if they work night shift and that's the time they can eat, I tell them do their food, come back, things like that. So how do we
That's a great
approach
point.
that in a way that it doesn't distract from the course in a way?
Accommodations that we can make that don't detract from, you know, their experience as students,
Yes,
essentially.
but also meets them where their culture is.
Yeah.
Because I also know when I was like in Puerto Rico, their school timeline is different than ours because they start earlier than we do. So when I would go to Puerto Rico and try and hang out with my cousins, my aunts and uncles would be like, no, they're in school. And I'm like, and then they would come home and be like, I'm so jealous of you, you're not in school, and like, you're on vacation and you can have fun and go to the beach and things like that. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I want to spend time with you, but your mom and dad said no. So.
That's a good point about holidays, yeah.
So what can we do what are some things that we've done? So I've mentioned the fact that I allow my students to call out if need be.
Mhm.
So again, one of the things, like as an educator, is just simply just asking, getting to know your students. Like, you know, what do you do during this time? Not necessarily say like, do you celebrate Christmas, or just like, what do you do in the month of December? What are some of your traditions? What are some of the activities that you and your family do? Like, you know, in a way that is that it doesn't reference like if you do this or not, but like to give them the opportunity to share, you know, anything or everything that they want to share with you.
Yeah, kind of showing that you're
That's a
not
good way.
assuming.
I like that, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
I mean, I guess from
She has the question.
Oh,
To
sorry.
the audience.
Go ahead, yeah.
This is related to a question I had, so I wanted to
Please,
bring
yeah.
it in while we're talking about this. Like Yvonne, you've talked about how important it is to get to know your students, and Nicole talking about being aware of the holidays that your staff might be celebrating. And I'm wondering if you all have, as educators, any like tips or practices for how to incorporate those conversations like early on to get to know your students, if it's like assignments, or how you sort of have those conversations early on to get to know your students, to know how to sort of approach them culturally sensitively, you know?
So you want me to? Okay.
No,
So
go ahead.
one of the first steps as an educator is to establish that safe environment.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one is like, you need to help your students get to know you as well. Okay, so that's how we would do it in the classroom. Like, you let them know who you are, and then you also give a counter example, like this is who I am, this is what I do, but I have a really, really good friend who is, you know, celebrates this and likes to do this, and you know, very different, but like, we are such good friends. Like, tell me, so what do you do? And like, what are some of the things that you would like to, you know, to try out? What are some of the things that you eat? So I would share some examples that I know that are common within my students, but then my pretend friend would be having some really odd different examples, because, you know, and that's important to share, because a lot of the kids might, like, even the food is very different, right? Even I belong to two different cultures, Puerto Rican and Ecuadorian, and the two completely cuisines, completely different, right? So our students might find things very odd, but give them that comfort to just share, you know, confidence to share, and not feel like they're being judged for their differences. So that's how I have handled things like that.
I love that, the connection.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like asking people about food is a good way to get them
Yeah.
talking too.
Yeah, I was gonna say, me and I forgot what day it was, and Gian, like, you're in the audience, I'll use it as an example, but we were talking about Dominican breakfast. So the fried cheese, the fried salami, the fried egg, and the mandua and stuff, and I was like, it was really cold that day, and we were like, you know what would sound really good right now? And they were like, what? I was like, I wish I had Dominican breakfast right now. And it has an actual name, but I can't pronounce it. And they're like, you're so right, that would be the perfect. And the one student didn't know what it was, so me and Gianna were talking about it, and we were like, this is what it is. And they're like, oh my God, that sounds amazing. And I was like, yeah, but it's so much work. So we found common ground in like food, and like some of my other students music, or like the movies or anime or things like that. But I also, my student workers know they're not allowed to say stupid or idiot behind the counter. They're not allowed to call themselves stupid. They're not allowed to call themselves an idiot. We changed that word to, oh, I'm having a silly day. Because if bad things are happening, or they feel like there's something they could have easily avoided. And I'm like, you're not stupid. That's you having an off day or being silly. So I take the moment to change the way words are seen. So me and Nick call ourselves like weirdos and nerds and things like that because we're re-embracing
Oh, with pride,
the word.
yeah.
To say, you know what, people told us that, but you know what, it's true. We are weirdos, we are nerds, but it makes us awesome. So like changing terms also helps them to be more open to me and understanding. They also recognize that there's a boundary though. So like as open as I am, there's still a boundary on like I'm still their boss, they're still the employee and things like that, like what they can or cannot tell me.
I really like what Yvonne said about like sort of a safe space. So, you know, when we have, when I teach or I'm leading a study tour or the expedition, we always say very early on, like, you know, here's the basic parameters of how this trip works. But if you have something that you're concerned about, it doesn't usually come down that much to culture or religion or language even that we've talked about a lot today. It's often more, in the case of the trips, more about like food and allergies, medical conditions, mental health, things like that students come to us to talk about. Sure, a couple of the other things, yes, but more often than not, it's about food and health issues. And we say, you know, if you want to come talk to us ahead of time, you know, you could talk to your professor or coordinator, you can come talk to me, we could set up an appointment. And sometimes it's just somebody comes in and the problem is just like, hey, I have some travel anxiety, and we kind of talk through that, some ways to mitigate that, and then that's all they need, and then they're good to go. Sometimes, you know, we will have a follow-up meeting. We've had meetings like where Dr. Leon John, our Chief Diversity Officer, has come in as well and helped talk through students and their concerns. It might be an LGBTQ student, it might be, you know, mental health, something else, it might be disability services. So we definitely, you know, bring in other people if we need to help manage the situations. But we want students to understand like that trip is for everybody, right? We want people to participate. And sometimes students will feel like they don't want to go because of, you know, they have a concern about something. And then we have, I would say, about an 80% success rate. Like somebody has a concern about something, they're kind of on the fence, but we say like, hey, we can help you or work with this, or we'll get your food preferences ahead of time, like whatever it is that we're able to accommodate, and then they feel better.
Yeah, it's basically about letting them know they can have that conversation with you.
Yeah,
and have that communication.
I was just going to say, I think the commonality there is just making them aware that speaking up is an option.
Right.
That sharing those concerns, those unique qualities, those whatever it is something that they can do.
Yeah.
I've had experience with students in writing when like I asked them to come up with topics for papers. I've had students come to me like, well, is it okay if I do this? Can I really do this? And yes, you can. And you know, it's just they're not always used to that, having that freedom, having that available forum to talk about that stuff, regardless of what the context is. Which actually, one of the last things I wanted to ask was, okay, we talked about cultural differences, we talked about, you know, our experiences learning in other environments, and the big question that I was going to have at the end here is, okay, what do we do with all this now? But I think we're already kind of touching on it, is the communication, the conversation's kind of like the first step that needs to take place to be, you know, what was the phrase you used, Yvonne? Culturally responsive educators. Just having those conversations, being prepared for those.
Right.
Yeah, it goes back to that saying of you don't know what you don't know until you ask.
Correct.
So I need to WD-40
It's a very loud door.
But we don't know what we don't know until we ask. So taking that moment each day, and like I ask my students every day, like, how are you doing today? How are your classes doing? We talked about professors, we talked about classes. I give them suggestions of what they could do to help it. They adore you, Dr. Bird. Just gonna throw that out there. Adore you. But letting them know like they can come talk to you and you have either advice for them or you're just a listening ear. Because sometimes they don't want advice, they just want to be heard.
True. I think an important part too is we often say like, let's have a conversation about this, or let's talk about this, right? Or you're welcome to come in and talk to me about that. And I think in all those instances, it's great to do that as a starting point. But I think what is also important is following up, right? So you check back in with that student, like, hey, I know we talked about this. You maybe said you're going to talk to your doctor about adjusting your medication. Like, have you done that, right? Or do you need to talk about that again? Or are you feeling better about that? Like, where are you at? right? I think that is really helpful. Or even if you're not maybe talking individually, just to like reiterating that, like, hey, we're at the halfway point of the semester, whatever it is. Or like we tell students on the trip, like, hey, I know we talked to you about these things before, but something may come up on the trip. Like, come find one of us, talk to us. We want you to feel, comfortable and happy and safe and all those things. So we kind of keep reminding them, like, it's not just a one-time conversation necessarily. It might be something that needs adjusting or following up.
Yeah.
All great points. I just want to just add on to, you mentioned, we are doing everything that, to get to know our students, to, support our students and to help them become, the best that they can be, but as we move forward, is there room for improvement and growth? Absolutely.
Yeah.
There is. And, and it's going to take time. And one part of it is, again, is that, as we're moving forward to, better educate our students, to better understand them, to help them to be the best that they can be, is to also understand that when, and again, this is part of being a culturally responsive teacher, is that not just wait for October for Hispanic Heritage Month, not wait for, for March, for, Women's Month, or February for, for all these different months to teach our students, but to do it throughout the entire year, not wait for a designated month to say, okay, this is going to be a month of all about, right? But you make sure that it is integrating. That's part of being that, of developing that culturally sustained pedagogy.
Yeah, because those identities don't stop outside of those
don't.
months
Of
or
course
those
not.
days or anything. That
Of
is
course not.
a person 24/7.
Right.
So understanding that, like, it doesn't have to be a one and done. It could be a, how do we talk about it, year round? So like me and Nick do displays, and we have a recipe book, so cookbooks upstairs, and we chose different torches from each one for cookbooks. Even though like next week is Thanksgiving, not everyone eats turkey and ham. So what are other recipes they can use and things like that?
Yeah.
We do have an insect cookbook up there since we had to throw it up there. But I want to take this time to open it up to our audience to ask questions.
Yeah, we've taken a couple questions already, but there are any
And
others?
the online audience too. You are not forgotten. I am paying attention to my phone. So I'm surprised you don't have questions.
I have another
Kelly has another question.
I just have another quick one.
Yeah.
For culturally sustained pedagogy, do you have any resources that you recommend for, like, if folks want to, aka me, want to learn more about that as a topic?
So there's a few. There is Natalie Wexler. There is Stephen Graham. Stephen Graham is such a wonderful researcher. I use him part of my framework of my own teaching when I teach writing to the pre-service teachers. There is, let me see, I'm drawing a blank.
No,
But those are
Put on the spot.
like the two main
Yeah, that's
main
great.
yeah.
And
And I can send
if
more.
you can think of more, if you want to like send us Nicole and I a list, we can put it
Sure.
on library social media. We can
Sure.
put it on
Absolutely.
in the on the video when we post it on YouTube, like in the description.
I
So
can
if
send you
people
a whole
want more
framework of
resources,
it.
we can
Thank
we
you.
can give them an exhaustive list.
Yes.
Make it available.
Absolutely. Mm.
Any other questions?
Sure.
I was like, you're quiet over there.
Yeah.
I was like, you're quiet over there.
I know. Actually, I like that question. So how can we incorporate it outside of the classroom? Like, what kinds of events could we add to help our students understand other students?
Mm.
Right? It's not only us that have to understand this
No.
cultural difference, but it's the students in the classroom understanding each
I
other's.
think
That's a great
Abs-
question.
absolutely.
I have the answer to that one.
Go for it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So actually, and I know we get 50 million emails, but I try to read all of them. The LUTZ Center, the Community Service Center,
Mm.
actually sends out emails about like volunteering. So they have like volunteering with the elderly, which we don't think about like as an identity or a culture, but it is. And when I was an undergrad, I loved doing my internship with the elderly. They have the best stories
No.
ever. Or another one I just saw is with, I didn't read it fully, but with a Hispanic community, like center, or even the Boys and Girls Clubs. Like, there are opportunities within your institution, you just have to seek them out, that could possibly take you out of the institution to a different place to learn more about that environment. Because being totally responsive isn't just like Hispanic, people of color, indigenous, things like that, but also the different ages and the different groups of body, like identities and things like that. So being aware of everyone around you, I think, is the first step, and acknowledging that there are other people around you. Because as much as we say, like, the politics of it all takes it away and makes it feel like we're only focusing on people of color, it's not. It's trying to get us to focus on everyone as an individual. Because no one person is the same, even twins. Identical twins are not the exact same. They have different personalities, things like that. So that's the example I like to give. Like, even identical twins aren't the same, but you still get to know both of them. And recognizing that, yes, there are differences and similarities. And we may not agree with those differences or similarities, but where can we meet each other in the middle? And, like, that's not to say there's going to be world peace or anything, but going back to, like, communicating and talking, taking that moment to understand.
Well, and Nicole, you mentioned the Lutz Center specifically for this campus. And yeah, I think that's true of not just this campus, but a lot of college campuses. Kelly and I were talking about that yesterday when we had our little international film festival here yesterday in the library for an International Education Week. It's like, there is constantly so much stuff going on any college campus that it's impossible to do half of it, not even all of it. And it's just, we can try to encourage people not just to show up to our classes and do the things that we ask them to, but to take advantage of all of the stuff that's out there, whether it's volunteering with the Lutz Center or going to the a club event that has a different cuisine that you might be unfamiliar with, or watching a foreign film that's being screened somewhere on campus, or it doesn't have to be as intensive as going on the summer expedition, although that is also a great way to do it.
So since I work a lot with student teachers, and sometimes I have student teachers who grew up in a rural little town, and now they're faced in here in Allentown, facing a very diverse population, and one of their huge concerns is like, well, I can't speak the language, or I don't know how to relate, and completely normal. And I tell them, well, this is a two-way street. Just like you need to get to know your students and their background, and their preferences and all that, they need to get to know you as well. So this is why, like in the example that I gave before, you model. So you model who you are, what are your traditions, what are your activities, what do you like to do. You have your pretend friend who does something different, but it is just as important for them to know your background, just like it's important for you to know their background. It's a two-way street. It's not a one-way street. Okay, just because you might be the one with with the different cultural background doesn't mean that yours gets thrown out the window. Absolutely not. It's the point here is for students to understand that there's not one culture is not more important than the other. One language is not more important than the other. One tradition is not more important than the other. It's that there are differences, and because there are differences, we need to be understanding and appreciate that difference.
Any questions from the? Okay, just wanted to make sure we didn't neglect them as we were.
So I didn't
fielding the
leave. I had
questions
to
here.
roll off camera to end the
Yes,
screen.
Nicole is also handling the tech stuff. So thank you, Yvonne, Kelly. Thanks for joining
Thanks
us,
very
guys.
much.
This was great. And thank you, those of you who joined us in person, those of you that watched online, and we'll see you for spring.